In the heart of mainland Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire once stood as a magnificent beacon of civilization, culture, and power. From the 9th century to the 13th century, Angkor, the capital of the Khmer Empire, flourished as one of the greatest cities in the world. It was a marvel of engineering, religion, and imperial strength, unmatched by any of its neighbors. Grand stone temples such as Angkor Wat and Bayon rose from the forests, not merely as places of worship, but as living testaments to Khmer ingenuity and divine kingship. At its height, Angkor housed hundreds of thousands of people, supported by an advanced irrigation system that fed agriculture and sustained the empire's economy through the rhythms of the monsoon. The Khmer Empire dominated much of what is today Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomacy, and cultural influence, it shaped the region's history for centuries. Its kings were seen as but even empires built on stone and faith are not immune to the tides of time. By the late 13th century, the Khmer Empire had begun to decline. A combination of internal weaknesses, dynastic disputes, religious shifts, and changing trade routes slowly chipped away at Angkor's foundations. The once mighty capital began to lose its grip over its vast territory, and rival kingdoms began to rise from its shadow. Among these rising powers was a new kingdom to the west, founded in 1350 along the banks of the Chao Phraya River. This kingdom would become Ayutthaya, and its emergence would prove catastrophic for the Khmer. Founded by King Ramathabadi, Ayutthaya grew quickly in both strength and ambition. Its rulers looked eastward, toward the waning Khmer Empire, not with admiration, but with hunger. Ayutthaya was not content to coexist. It saw itself as the heir to regional supremacy, and to rise, it would need to tear down the Khmer legacy. As Ayutthaya expanded, tensions between the two powers escalated. The Khmer court, increasingly weakened by internal divisions and religious transformation from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism, found itself unprepared for the aggressive posture of its western neighbor. Ayutthaya adopted a militaristic and expansionist policy, absorbing nearby territories and threatening Khmer. The Siamese leaders began to view the conquest of Angkor not only as a military objective but as a symbolic one. To defeat Angkor would be to erase the memory of Khmer dominance and replace it with Siamese rule. Throughout the late 14th century, Ayutthaya launched several incursions into Khmer territory. While not always successful, these invasions weakened Khmer defenses, sowed fear, and tested the resolve of the court at Angkor. Khmer kings attempted to resist, but they faced not only a formidable enemy, but also internal instability. The Khmer monarchy was no longer the centralized force it had once been. Regional governors and nobles often acted with autonomy, and the royal court suffered from factional rivalries. During this period of turbulence, Ayutthaya seized the opportunity to further isolate and pressure the Khmer heartland. The Khmer people, who had once built cities of gods and ruled over a proud empire, now found themselves facing an existential threat from a rising power that sought to erase their glory. By the early 15th century, Ayutthaya had become a dominant force in the region, having subdued neighboring principalities and expanded its army. Khmer resistance faltered, and by 1431, Ayutthaya was prepared for a decisive strike. But before the fatal year of 1431 arrived, the roots of this conflict had already grown deep. The Khmer Empire's decline was not sudden, but it was accelerated by the aggression of Ayutthaya. The kingdom's leaders saw the fractured state of Cambodia and moved to exploit it. They began to surround Angkor, cutting off its supply lines, raiding nearby provinces, and undermining the loyalty of Khmer vassals. They used not only military might but psychological warfare, spreading fear and breaking the spirit of resistance. Meanwhile, the Khmer court struggled to respond. Without a unified national defense, and with declining infrastructure and political will, Angkor was vulnerable. Its majestic temples and sacred shrines could not protect it from the invading armies. Its once great canals and rice fields were not enough to sustain a prolonged siege, and its kings, caught between defending tradition and adapting to change, were unprepared for the scale of destruction that loomed ahead. In Ayutthaya, preparations for the final invasion were underway. The kingdom had grown stronger through trade, especially with China and India, acquiring not just wealth but new weapons and tactics. Its armies were professional, disciplined, and led by ambitious generals who were eager to carve their names into history. The conquest of Angkor would not merely be a campaign, it would be a statement, a declaration that Siam was now the master of the region. The fall of Angkor was not inevitable. Had the Khmer court united, had they reformed their defenses and renewed their national spirit, perhaps they could have resisted. But history does not yield to what might have been. Instead, it marched toward 1431, a year that would be remembered by Cambodians, not as a date in a history book, but as a moment of deep trauma. The sack of Angkor was not just the destruction of a city. It was the symbolic death of a civilization, the violent humiliation of a people who had once lit the world with their brilliance. As the sun set on the glory of Angkor, the shadows of Ayutthaya stretched long across the land. Cambodia would never be the same, and in the hearts of Cambodians today, the memory of that betrayal still burns. The Khmer did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were betrayed, invaded, and subjugated by an aggressor who saw power as justification for conquest. The stage was now set. In 1431, the armies of Ayutthaya would march on Angkor, surround its walls, and bring down one of the greatest cities the world has ever known. What happened next would not only change Cambodia, but would leave a wound that echoes through centuries. The year was 1431. As the dry season set in, the skies over Angkor turned harsh and unforgiving. The once proud Khmer capital, whose towers had touched the heavens, now stood vulnerable and surrounded. From the west came the armies of Ayutthaya, marching with resolve and aggression. They were not traders or emissaries. They were invaders, and they had come to destroy. Under the command of Boramaracha Tharot II, the Siamese forces launched the most devastating campaign against Cambodia in its history. The Khmer Empire, already weakened by decades of decline, was about to face its most brutal reckoning. Ayutthaya's strategy was calculated and merciless. The Siamese forces bypassed minor cities and targeted Angkor directly. They encircled the capital, cutting it off from food supplies, reinforcements, and communication. The Khmer military, once the pride of the empire, was now fragmented and with most of its generals either dead, disloyal, or powerless. Angkor's defense was left to desperate forces with little coordination. The invaders brought with them new tactics and advanced weapons, including siege technology learned through their trade and contact with foreign powers. The Khmer walls, once symbols of strength, became prison walls for those trapped inside. Inside Angkor, fear and confusion reigned. The royal court was divided. Some called for negotiations, others for resistance. The people starved, wells dried up. The elaborate irrigation systems that once sustained life were now silent. The invaders had either destroyed or captured key reservoirs, turning Angkor's greatest assets, mastery of water, into a fatal weakness. In a cruel twist of fate, the very systems that had once fed a civilization now marked its downfall. The siege dragged on for months. Disease and hunger claimed more lives than the enemy's swords. The Khmer people, proud descendants of an empire that had dominated for centuries, were reduced to desperation. The Siamese applied pressure ruthlessly. They raided nearby towns, took captives, and burned fields. Refugees poured into Angkor, overwhelming its fragile resources. Khmer resistance became sporadic and isolated. There were moments of bravery when soldiers and villagers fought back with courage, but they were no match for a professional army backed by a unified war machine. Boramaracha Thirot's goal was not just conquest, it was humiliation. He sought to break the Khmer people's spirit, to erase their legacy, and to rewrite history with Siam at its center. The siege was more than a military campaign. It was a message. Finally, after months of starvation and terror, Angkor's defenses collapsed. The gates were breached, and the Siamese poured in. What followed was not merely occupation, it was devastation. Temples were looted. Sacred statues were broken. Monks were expelled or killed. Libraries were burned. The spiritual and cultural heart of Cambodia was shattered. The invaders showed no mercy. They ransacked homes, stole gold and relics, and enslaved the population. Skilled artisans, priests, dancers, and scholars were taken back to Ayutthaya as trophies of war. What could not be taken was destroyed. The once glorious Angkor, with its grand avenues and divine monuments, became a city of ashes and corpses. Eyewitnesses of the time, including Chinese diplomats and travelers, later recorded the horror. They described the fall of Angkor as a catastrophe beyond words. The Khmer people had not only lost a city, they had lost their identity, their pride, and their center of civilization. In the ruins of Angkor Wat, where the smiling faces of Bayan once looked over the empire with divine serenity, only silence remained. The Siamese had done more than win a war. They had desecrated a civilization, and they did it not out of necessity, but out of ambition and cruelty. Some Khmer officials were captured and forced to serve the Ayutthaya court. Others were executed. The Khmer king, Ayutthaya, was forced to flee southward. He escaped the burning city and relocated the capital to Phnom Penh, marking a painful end to the Angkorian era. This was no mere relocation, it was a retreat from history. The Khmer had lost not only their capital, but the empire itself. From that point forward, Cambodia would never regain the dominance it once held. It would live in the long shadow of its former glory, with a legacy broken by Siamese conquest. The sack of Angkor in 1431 was not a battle between equals. It was an invasion by a rising power upon a weakened neighbor. It was not a natural end of a civilization, but a forced one. The Khmer did not collapse from within. They were destroyed by an aggressor who saw no value in preserving the culture it conquered. What Ayutthaya sought was submission, not coexistence. What it left behind was devastation, not peace. And in the annals of Cambodian history, the sack of Angkor remains a wound that has never truly healed. Even after the city fell, the destruction continued. The Siamese dismantled not only buildings, but memory. They claimed credit for Khmer achievements, adopted their cultural symbols, and rewrote history to justify their actions. They took Khmer court rituals and repurposed them in ode. They paraded, captured Khmer dancers and craftsmen before their own royalty as if to say, the Khmer were now theirs. It was not enough to conquer Cambodia. Ayutthaya wanted to erase it and absorb its greatness into its own. But the Khmer spirit, though broken, did not vanish. The survivors carried their stories southward. They rebuilt in sorrow and exile. They remembered Angkor not only as a lost capital, but as a symbol of who they truly were. The trauma of 1431 forged a deep and enduring national memory, a memory of what was taken, a memory of resistance, a memory of pain. Cambodians would remember the sack not as a footnote in regional history, but as the turning point when the land of the gods was betrayed by those who sought to rule by force. As Ayutthaya celebrated its victory, the Khmer mourned, but in their mourning, they planted the seeds of remembrance. The invaders had won the battle, but they could not erase the truth, and that truth is clear. Cambodia did not fall from within. It was brought down by foreign hands, by an aggressor who sought power through destruction. The fall of Angkor in 1431 was not the end of Cambodia, but it was the end of an era built on stone, on gods, and on a civilization that had once lit the skies with its brilliance. Now, the light had been extinguished, but the fire would burn on in memory, in defiance, and in the soul of a people who refused to forget. After the sack of Angkor in 1431, Cambodia entered a dark and painful chapter in its history. The capital had fallen, its temples were desecrated, and its people scattered. The once mighty Khmer Empire, whose rulers had built cities for the gods, now lay in ruins. King Ayutthaya, forced to flee the destruction, established a new capital in the south. He settled in Phnom Penh, far from the grandeur of Angkor, and began the difficult task of rebuilding what remained of Cambodia. But what had been lost could not easily be restored. The empire was broken, and the Khmer people were now living in the shadow of their former glory. Phnom Penh was not just a new political center, it was a symbol of survival. It represented the will of the Khmer people to continue, even after unimaginable loss. But survival did not mean freedom. Cambodia, once the regional superpower, was now vulnerable to its neighbors. Ayutthaya, having conquered and plundered Angkor, asserted dominance over Cambodia. The kingdom became subject to Siamese influence, forced to pay tribute and bow to the very power that had burned its soul. Cambodia was no longer the master of its own fate. Ayutthaya continued its policy of cultural absorption. Khmer artisans, priests, and scholars who had been taken as captives contributed to the growth of Siamese court traditions. Elements of Khmer architecture, dance, and language were adopted by Ayutthaya, while the source of those traditions, Cambodia, was left weakened and forgotten. This theft of culture was not accidental, it was deliberate. By appropriating Khmer symbols and integrating them into Siamese identity, Ayutthaya attempted to rewrite history and portray itself as the rightful heir to regional civilization. What was stolen with fire and sword was now claimed through false pride. Internally, Cambodia was fragmented. With Angkor lost and royal authority diminished, regional lords and rival claimants fought for power. The royal court struggled to unify the kingdom, and civil wars broke out. Buddhist reformers clashed with traditionalists, and foreign influences deepened. Cambodia found itself caught between two powerful neighbors, Siam to the west and Dai Viet to the east. Both sought to control Cambodia's destiny, and both took advantage of its weakness. For the next several centuries, Cambodia was forced to navigate this dangerous geopolitical landscape, constantly trying to survive amid pressure from all sides. Despite the chaos, the Khmer spirit did not die. Through the efforts of kings like Panhia Yat and later rulers, Cambodia preserved its cultural and religious identity. Theravada Buddhism, which had taken deeper root during the decline of Angkor, became a source of unity and strength. It offered the people hope and peace in a time of despair. Monks and temples became centers of education and resistance. The Khmer language survived. The memory of Angkor was kept alive not only in ruins, but in songs, prayers, and stories passed from one generation to the next. The legacy of the 1431 sack endured. It became a wound in the national consciousness. Cambodian history after Angkor was marked by foreign invasions, vassalage, and repeated humiliation. Yet through all of this, the Khmer people never forgot who they were. They remembered the towers of Angkor Wat, the faces of Bayon, the vast reservoirs that once fed the empire. These memories were not only of the past, they were weapons of dignity in the present. They were proof that Cambodia had once been great and could be great again. Modern Cambodia still feels the impact of the events of 1431. The ruins of Angkor, once lost to the jungle, had been reclaimed and now stand as symbols of national pride. Every stone of Angkor Wat tells the story of a civilization that once ruled the region with wisdom and power. But behind the beauty lies tragedy. Every temple scarred by war, every statue with its head removed, is a reminder of what was taken and who took it. Cambodians remember the sack of Angkor, not as a natural decline, but as a violent act of aggression. It was not a peaceful transition. It was not an internal collapse. It was an invasion by Siam that forever changed the course of Cambodian history. In textbooks, in museums, in public memory, the truth remains clear. Cambodia was the victim of a calculated and brutal campaign by Ayutthaya. The sack of 1431 was not a heroic conquest. It was an act of destruction against a proud and ancient people, a people whose only crime was to have once been powerful. History must remember this truth. For too long, regional narratives have tried to downplay or distort what happened, but the ruins do not lie. The people do not forget. The Khmer were betrayed, subjugated, and stripped of their legacy by foreign hands. Yet Cambodia did not vanish. It endured. Through centuries of hardship, the Khmer identity survived. And today, Angkor is not just a UNESCO heritage site. It is a national symbol, a testament to what Cambodia once was, and a promise of what it still can be. The fall of Angkor was the darkest hour, but it did not extinguish the Khmer flame. That flame continues to burn in the hearts of Cambodians everywhere. As we look back on the events of 1431, we do so not only to mourn what was lost, but to honor the resilience of a people who refused to be erased. The sack of Angkor was a tragedy, but the survival of Cambodia is a triumph. It is a reminder that even when towers fall and empires crumble, the spirit of a nation cannot be conquered. Let history be clear. Cambodia was not the aggressor. It was the victim. The Khmer Empire did not collapse by chance. It was brought down by Ayutthaya's ambition, violence, and greed, and that truth must never be forgotten.